interesse, credo, lo dico da osservatore esterno, mai come queste elezioni, ma l'ambasciatore mi potrebbe smentire sicuramente, mai come quest'anno c'è da parte dell'opinione pubblica una grande attenzione alle elezioni americane. Forse ecco, c'è più consapevolezza anche di che cosa si gioca nelle elezioni, quali saranno anche i riverberi sul versante internazionale. Non ho mai, a memoria mia non ricordo, un interesse, una quantità di iniziative, di talk show, giornali che ne parlano in prima pagina, quindi vuol dire che effettivamente è un evento non solo che riguarda l'America, è chiaramente una delle più grandi, anzi la più grande potenza al mondo, ma chiaramente indirettamente o direttamente riguarda tutto il mondo e riguarderà anche l'Italia e l'Europa. Quindi Flavia, lasciate la parola, ringrazio il nostro relatore e grazie a voi di essere presenti.
Non so se adesso sì, funziona. Grazie al direttore Sgalla per questa bella introduzione, grazie per l'ospitalità in questa bellissima sede. Questo evento è stato coorganizzato dal Centro Studi Americani e da Formiche e davvero ci tenevamo che oggi potessimo anche a Roma sentire un punto di vista diverso sugli Stati Uniti, perché sarà prezioso ascoltare oggi le parole di Matthew Kroenig sul futuro degli Stati Uniti e anche sul futuro del rapporto tra Washington e Bruxelles, perché Matthew è autore di 2 libri di successo, l'ultimo dei quali è dedicato alla politica estera repubblicana degli Stati Uniti da Reagan a Trump, e quello precedente invece sul rapporto tra gli USA e la Cina. 2 libri davvero di successo e interessanti. E Matthew è il vicepresidente dell'Atlantic Council, che è uno dei think tank più autorevoli di Washington, ed è anche professore alla Georgetown University. Tra l'altro ama molto il nostro paese, anche delle figure, diciamo, che hanno fatto la storia del nostro paese, la storia politica. Infatti ha tenuto per un mese a Fiesole un corso sulla figura di Machiavelli, quindi davvero è un appassionato. Ma soprattutto Matthew è una figura cruciale nella definizione della postura strategica degli Stati Uniti e della loro politica estera. Io diciamo, mi taccio, rivolgerò soltanto delle parole, delle domande a Matthew, perché è importante insomma, che sentiamo il suo punto di vista. Allora, Matthew, nelle poche settimane che hanno insomma, preceduto questi giorni abbiamo davvero visto di tutto dagli Stati Uniti, cioè la convergenza di tutti i leader occidentali a Washington per il summit NATO, poi il drammatico attentato al candidato ex presidente Donald Trump, la convention repubblicana a Milwaukee che invece ha consacrato appunto Trump per la corsa alla Casa Bianca, il passo indietro di Biden e il passo in avanti di Kamala Harris, quindi davvero incredibile. Cosa ci dobbiamo aspettare, ecco, ancora per i prossimi giorni, 100 giorni che ci separano dal voto americano?
Grazie mille, è un piacere di essere qui. Parli un po' di italiano, ho abitato a Firenze 20 anni fa e ho imparato un po' di italiano.
Matthew, your microphone is off. Ecco, now.
Ok. Buonasera, è un piacere di essere qui in questo edificio bellissimo e grazie mille per Formiche e Centro Studi Americani per l'invitazione, sono contento di essere qui. E sono stato qui 5 anni fa per parlare del libro, prima è un piacere di essere qui per parlare del libro nuovo. Ho abitato in Italia 20 anni fa e quindi parlicchio un po' di italiano e torno ogni anno per insegnare un corso di Machiavelli. Ma se non vi dispiacerebbe, parlo in inglese perché posso chiacchierare in italiano, ma è difficile di parlare delle cose serie. So, thank you. Good to be back. So on your first question, You know, a month ago, if you had said that President Trump will be within inches of an assassination, I wouldn't have believed it. If you had said that Biden will drop out and that Harris would be the nominee, I wouldn't have believed it. So US politics can be unpredictable. And I've almost always gotten it wrong. I was an advisor to Mitt Romney in 2012. He didn't win. I was an advisor to Marco Rubio in 2016. He didn't win. So take my predictions with a grain of salt. But I do think that Trump is in a strong position. He's leading in the national polls, both against Biden and against Harris. If you look at the important swing states, he's leading in the polls, especially in the Sun Belt in the South, and is either leading or close in the blue wall of Midwestern states. So if I were forced to predict, I would predict that Trump will be the next US president. I think that Harris will be a stronger competitor than Biden. Some of the concerns US voters had with Biden were his mental capacity, but with Harris, a younger candidate, that's less of a concern. Also, we've already seen that Harris is energizing female voters and voters of color in a way that Biden could not do. And then also, Harris has the potential to try to distance herself from some of Biden's less successful policies. She could say, yes, that's the way we did it in the first term, but now that I'm president, we'll go in a different direction. So I do think that she'll be a tougher competitor. But if I were forced to predict, I would predict that Trump is likely to win the election, and so I think the Italian government and the Italian people should prepare for that possibility.
Come hai detto appunto, Kamala Harris, la sua corsa alla Casa Bianca, che naturalmente è una corsa di un treno già partito, quindi è una corsa più complicata, e molti osservatori ci hanno spiegato come, ecco, Harris non abbia, ecco, un radicato background in fatto di relazioni internazionali. Secondo te quale potrebbe essere, ecco, la politica estera della nuova amministrazione, di una nuova amministrazione democratica che, ecco, abbracci il Medio Oriente, la Cina e passando per l'Europa e anche l'Ucraina?
Yes. Well, I agree with the premise of the question. I think she's not that deep on foreign policy. You know, Biden had been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades. Harris's focus has been more as a prosecutor in judicial matters. But she has been vice president for 4 years. She does have a foreign policy team. So I think that she might bring some of her new people with her. Phil Gordon is her national security advisor. Rebecca Listner is her deputy national security advisor, my former student at Georgetown. So she might bring some of her people with her. But I would expect a lot of continuity in terms of personnel, since she doesn't have that deep background in foreign policy. And there's a saying in Washington that personnel is policy. So I think if she keeps a lot of Biden's people in key positions or in the administration, we will see a lot of continuity. So I think in Europe, topic of interest to Italians, I think there will be strong support for NATO. In Ukraine, I think we'll see a continuation of this kind of policy of as long as it takes, supporting Ukraine, although there could be difficulty getting the aid from Congress. In the Middle East, I think we'll likely see, well, actually let me come to China and Asia first. I think we'd see a continuity there. And my criticism of the Biden policy has essentially been saying the right things on China, but not backing it with resources. So the Biden administration says that China is the greatest threat facing the country, that the threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is the #1 planning scenario for the Pentagon. Yet, if you take into account inflation, the United States is actually cutting its defense budget. It's at historic lows as a percent of GDP. During the Cold War, the United States spent about 7% of GDP on defense. Now we're at about 3%. So I think there's something of a say-do gap on China that, again, Biden administration is talking tough but not following through. And unfortunately, I think we'd see that continue. And then in the Middle East, I think we could see the biggest shift because I think Biden has been torn on Middle East policy. On one hand, his initial instinct was we have Israel's back in its war against Hamas. And then we saw the progressive wing in the United States turn against that and worry about the humanitarian suffering of the Palestinian people. And so I think Biden's been indecisive and is making neither side happy. The pro-Israeli faction thinks he's not strong enough. The pro-Palestinian factions think that he's not been tough enough with Israel. If you look at Harris's statements, she's more with the progressive wing, I think, more critical of Israel, more supportive of the Palestinians. And so I think that is one area where we could see the biggest difference of maybe her coming out even stronger against Israel, Netanyahu. And just this week, we saw that she skipped Netanyahu's speech to the US Congress, which was something of a symbolic gesture, I think, of what her stance might be.
Allora, prima di farti la prossima domanda, ti ringrazio per le tue osservazioni. Volevo prima di tutto salutare e ringraziare tutti gli ospiti che sono qui, tutti i rappresentanti delle istituzioni che sono qui presenti e salutare anche chi ci sta seguendo da remoto. E ti volevo anche dire che puoi anche parlare qualche minuto in più per le risposte alle domande, poi you can put more minutes for each questions answers. C'è, diciamo, finora abbiamo parlato più che altro di questioni che riguardano molto gli Stati Uniti, ma c'è dal fronte opposto una domanda che invece interessa molto il pubblico italiano, cioè c'è molta apprensione sulla candidatura di Trump in Europa e in Italia e le possibili conseguenze, ecco, nelle relazioni transatlantiche. Secondo te la vittoria dei repubblicani potrebbe comunque compromettere la posizione sull'Ucraina e anche l'unità nella NATO?
Well, I was asked to spend more time in my responses, and one of my jobs is a professor where I speak for 75 minutes at a time, so I can do that. And this question will allow me to tie back to some of the to your previous question about Biden's foreign policy. So I think you're right that in some quarters in Europe there is concern about what a Trump 2 foreign policy might look like. Although I do have to say I think that's maybe exaggerated in the media, because when I talk to officials in European governments, including in the Italian government, I think there is more of a cautious optimism that they would be able to work with a Trump administration. If you think about what the Trump 1 administration looked like, yes, there was a lot of superficial chaos, tweets, Trump saying one thing, maybe doing something else. But the underlying policy, I think, was pretty good. We had peace in Europe, historic peace in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords and Israel making peace with some of its regional neighbors. Coming back to Europe, the Trump campaign has said that Putin invaded his neighbors, invaded Georgia under Bush, invaded Ukraine the first time under Obama, invaded Ukraine the second time under Biden, but didn't invade anyone while Trump was president. And yes, while Trump was critical of NATO, that ultimately he strengthened NATO by getting NATO countries to spend more. 2 new countries were allowed into NATO in the Trump administration. U.S. spending on NATO actually increased during the Trump administration. And then if you turn to Asia, I think the Trump administration does deserve a lot of credit for declaring competition with China as a foremost priority. I think that took courage. I'm not sure that Hillary Clinton or Marco Rubio would have done that, but I think it was the right call, and we've seen that Biden has largely kept that approach in place with tougher tariffs against China, has helped the European Union to come along with a tougher approach, and NATO and Italy with a tougher approach to China. And just to pause, congratulations to Italy for pulling out of the One Belt, One Road agreement. I think that was an important step and really helpful for the transatlantic alliance. So I think that's point one. You know, the Trump one's foreign policy was pretty good, I would argue. And then if you look at the Biden foreign policy, I think there have been successes, but there have also been failures. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, that was really done in a chaotic way without enough engagement with NATO. The failures, I would argue, of deterrence in Europe and the Middle East. We do have two major wars there now that weren't there when Biden took office. So I think we have to be realistic about what a Biden 2 administration might look like. Harris 1, because Biden 1 wasn't so great. So going to a Trump 2, and I should say I did just write a book about this. If you're interested, it was published in March. It's called We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy and the New Cold War. And based off the famous Reagan quote about the first Cold War. Ronald Reagan was asked, "What is your policy toward the Soviet Union?" And he said, "It's simple, we win, they lose." And so use that quote for the title of this book as we think about the new competition with China. One concern people have about a Trump 2 administration is, well, who are the people that would work in a Trump 2 administration? And places like the New York Times say, well, it would only be loyalists, people who will do whatever Trump says, they won't be qualified. But Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, has given indication that he'd be willing to serve. Robert O'Brien, former National Security Advisor, has said he'd be interested in serving in a Trump 2 administration. Tom Cotton, a senator in the U.S. Congress on the Armed Services Committee, is mentioned as a possible Secretary of Defense candidate. Senator Haggerty, former ambassador to Japan, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has expressed interest in being Secretary of State. So I do think you would see qualified people serving in a Trump 2 administration. And then also on some of the policies, Ukraine, for example. What is our strategy in Ukraine? The Biden administration has said they'll support Ukraine as long as it takes, but as long as it takes to do what? Do we think that Ukraine is going to win a decisive military victory and take back all of its territory, including Crimea? That would be nice, but I don't think that's realistic at this point. It seems like we are in this kind of defense-dominant war along the current lines. And so I fear that the current Biden approach will be to spend billions of more dollars, lose millions more, or thousands more lives, essentially to end up with a ceasefire of where we are now. What the Trump administration has said is that, or what Trump has said is that he wants to end the war within 24 hours. And as often with Trump, I think that's a rhetorical flourish. I don't think he literally means in one day. But I think what he means is he wants to end the war quickly. And he has laid out a strategy for how he would do that. He'd say, I'll go to Zelensky and say, you need to negotiate or else your aid will be in jeopardy. But what he also said, that again often gets skipped over by the New York Times, is I'll go to Putin and say, Putin, you need to negotiate or else I'll give Ukraine more than they've ever got. So essentially threatening to give Ukraine even more aid than Biden as a way to put pressure on them to negotiate and I think to try to wind the war down along the current lines. And Reasonable people can disagree, but I think that's a reasonable approach and probably gets to the same outcome that the Biden strategy does, but sooner, spending less money, and with fewer lives lost. So in short, I don't think Europe should worry about a Trump 2 administration. I guess final point here, and we're democracies. The United States and Italy have been democracies for a long time. We've been allies in NATO for 75 years. We've had a lot of elections, a lot of changes in our politicians, but the transatlantic bond has remained strong, and I think the transatlantic bond will remain strong, whether it's a Trump administration or a Harris administration. I guess final point, since you said I can talk longer. For the U.S.-Italy relationship, we would also have then a center-right government in the United States, a center-right government in Italy, and so I think there would be agreement not just on some of the foreign policy issues, but also on some of the underlying societal values. And so I think that's an additional issue that could help bring the United States and Italy even closer together in a Trump administration.
Bene, chiarissimo. Dall'Ucraina invece il Presidente del Consiglio italiano, Giorgia Meloni, ha il Memorandum of Understanding con la Cina, quindi non aderisce al Belt and Road. La prossima settimana Meloni sarà da Xi Jinping a Pechino. Ecco, proprio con il rapporto con la Cina sarà cruciale anche per una possibile rielezione di Trump nella sua politica estera. Come evolverà secondo te la Great Power Competition in caso di vittoria appunto dei repubblicani, e quale consiglio daresti, visto che comunque siamo in Italia, a Giorgia Meloni che si sta recando a Pechino?
Well, I do think that China poses the greatest threat to the United States and the rules-based international system. And this is a rare point of bipartisan agreement in Washington. Republicans and Democrats agree that China poses the greatest threat. So one, it's an economic threat. China's systematically stealing intellectual property from the United States, investing in sensitive critical infrastructure in the United States, in Europe, in Italy. So there's an economic dimension. There's a technological dimension, and we often take it for granted, but essentially the West and the free world have been technological leaders since at least the time of the Industrial Revolution, maybe even before, since the Renaissance. And so we've taken it for granted that then we can embed our values, our democratic values in the technology. But what happens if China dominates the technology of the 21st century? What happens if China controls digital infrastructure, 5G, and they embed their autocratic norms in the technology? And we already see that they're doing that. For example, developing artificial intelligence for facial recognition to help dictators spy on their own people, and then they export this technology to other countries. What does that mean for democracy around the world? There's also a military threat. China has said that it wants to take Taiwan and that it will do that through military force if necessary. A major war between China and Taiwan likely could involve the United States. President Biden has said 4 times that the United States would fight to defend Taiwan. So if there's a major war between the United States and China over Taiwan, the 2 largest economies on Earth, that obviously has global implications, including for Italy. There'd likely be a global depression. And then also, unlike Russia, China has an enormous capability, and I think China does essentially want to overturn the rules-based international system and create a new global system centered around Beijing that's more conducive to China's autocratic values. So I think this really is a long-term competition about the state of global order. So the stakes here are really important, and I do think that this would be the number one priority of the Trump administration, the competition with China. The Biden administration has said they see the relationship with China in three parts. They say it's part cooperation, part competition, and part confrontation. I think that's not accurate. There's very little real cooperation with China. I think it's mostly competition and confrontation, and I think that the Trump administration would recognize that. For example, the Biden administration says, well, let's cooperate with China on global public health. That would be nice, but we saw during COVID that China is not a cooperative actor when it comes to global public health. They say, let's cooperate with China on arms control. That would be nice, but we see that China is engaging in the largest nuclear arms buildup since the 1960s, increasing the size of its nuclear arsenal five-fold between now and 2035. In other areas as well. So I think it would be a more confrontational approach with China. My advice to Maloney is that I think to get this right, the free world does need to work together. So when it comes to economic de-risking, for example, if the United States cuts off or de-risks with China, but China just goes to Europe or to Japan and is able to engage in free economic exchange, buy technologies or other critical infrastructures it needs, the U.S. strategy can't work. So we do need Europe on this. Also militarily, I think that we want to show China that if you invade Taiwan, it's not just a conflict between you and Taiwan, it's not just a conflict between you and Taiwan and the United States, it's potentially a rupture with the entire free world, and the entire free world has a stake in this. And so I think European countries engaging in symbolic shows of force in the Indo-Pacific to show that they're there and present can help. And so I'm very pleased to hear that Italy has a warship in the region right now, the Cavour, and I think that is terrific. Even just diplomatic statements saying that the free world wants peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, I think is helpful, and was very happy to see at the G7 meeting in Bari that the final G7 communique repeated that language about wanting peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And then coming back to the de-risking, I was also pleased to learn on this trip about Italy's golden rule, about blocking Chinese investments into Italian infrastructure. So it sounds like Italy's already doing a lot of the right things, and I guess my advice would be to continue that.
Grazie Matthew. Bibi Netanyahu è stato di recente negli Stati Uniti, ha incontrato il presidente Biden, ha parlato al congresso americano. Oggi il presidente Herzog è stato nel nostro paese, ha incontrato Sergio Mattarella, poi Giorgia Meloni. Ecco, come prevede che potrà evolvere il conflitto a Gaza contro Hamas e quello contemporaneo verso il Libano e gli Houthi? E poi un'altra domanda che per noi è molto attuale, oltre alla minaccia russa e alla minaccia cinese, per l'Occidente ecco, è arrivato il momento anche dell'aggiungersi di un nuovo attore, cioè quello iraniano, la minaccia iraniana?
Yes, it's a good question, and we're going region by region. And I think that makes sense. I would point out that unfortunately these adversaries are, of course, increasingly working together. And we have a new kind of axis of autocracies with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea working together. China and Russia have declared a no-limits partnership. Iran and North Korea are providing weapons to Russia for its war against Ukraine. Iran, China, and Russia are conducting joint military exercises. Russia and China are engaged in joint weapons production. And in fact, the cooperation between these powers is greater than the cooperation among the Axis powers on the eve of World War II. And the Axis powers caused a lot of damage. So I think we should be very concerned about this new axis of autocracies. And so I do think the challenge facing the free world is how can the United States, Europe, Japan work together to counter Russia, China, Iran, North Korea at the same time. But coming to the Middle East in particular, I think this is where you'd likely see the biggest shift between a Trump and a Biden administration. And I'd say going back to the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, the Middle East has maybe become the most partisan issue in U.S. foreign policy. So we saw the Biden administration sign the Iran nuclear deal. Well, actually, let me back up. Prior to that, essentially U.S. Foreign policy was to work with traditional allies and partners in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, against Iran, against terrorist groups. And then with the Obama administration and the Iran nuclear deal, we saw that flip with Democrats saying, well, actually, we can work with Iran, we can negotiate with Iran. Maybe these traditional partners aren't so great. Trump came into office and went back 180 degrees to the previous policy and said, no, we're tearing up the nuclear deal, we're imposing maximum pressure, sanctions on Iran, we're going to work with our traditional allies and partners. We can debate whether that made sense, but there were real benefits to that. One was the Abraham Accords. I don't think we would have gotten this historic peace agreement between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors without that tough approach on Iran. The Biden administration was then elected and went back to the Obama approach. And so their approach to the Middle East was, let's re-enter the nuclear deal with Iran. And maybe our traditional partners aren't so great. Biden called Saudi Arabia a pariah state, criticized the human rights abuses. And I would argue that essentially this hasn't worked, that Iran's closer to a nuclear weapon now than it's ever been. There's been a failure of deterrence. Iran feels that it can support Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in the region. And let's be clear, these aren't independent conflicts. Iran is the head of the snake, providing the arms and the finances to these terror groups. And so we can try to hit back against the Houthis. We can try to negotiate with Hamas, but ultimately it's Iran. That's the problem. And we saw in the Trump administration when Iran conducted an attack that killed Americans, Trump hit back and killed this Iranian general, Soleimani. And I think that sent a strong signal in the region, but also to the world, that the United States is still a military superpower. And I would argue that Iran was deterred after that. Now I think we have a complete failure of deterrence, with the Houthis still conducting attacks on international shipping, although the Italians have played a helpful role in countering that, so thank you for that. Hamas, conducting this horrific terror attack, and the Biden administration, I think, being confused about should we support Israel or not. And then most egregious of all, this massive direct Iranian attack against Israel, 200 rockets and drones against Israel. Thank goodness, U.S. and allied missile defenses were able to shoot almost all of them down. And then the Biden administration asked Israel not to retaliate, which I think was a mistake. They just suffered a massive attack, and then we say, accept it. A bully punches you in the face, and you just say, okay, thank you. So I do think with Trump you'd see a return more to the traditional approach of being tough against Iran, tough against terrorist groups in the region, and working more closely with traditional partners like Israel and the Gulf states. And so I think Trump would, well, he has said that he wants Israel to finish the job and to finish it quickly. So I don't think he wants to see a long war in the region, but I do think he wants to see Israel win and would be less interested in some kind of peace agreement that keeps Hamas in place.
Altre domande a me, però diciamo che l'impostazione tra americani era quella dialogo. Il microfono che ecco, forse è meglio. Ah, ok, grazie. E quindi ti avrei voluto fare altre domande, ma mi attengo, diciamo, ai tempi che ci eravamo prefissati. Un'ultima domanda è indipendentemente su chi vincerà le elezioni americane, come cambierà, se cambierà a tuo avviso, il rapporto transatlantico tra Stati Uniti e l'Europa? Poi chiudiamo.
Well, I guess maybe as a final question, just to point out that it's really remarkable, I think, what the United States, Italy, and our other democratic partners have accomplished since World War II. And I'm working on a book on this now of kind of the post-World War II international system. From the 1600s until 1945, between 1 to 2% of the human population could expect to die in armed conflict. Now that number's less than 0.1%. 0 great power wars in 70 years. And so I think this rules-based international system, NATO, US alliances in the Indo-Pacific, have made the world objectively much safer than any period of world history. If you look at the kind of economic dimensions of the post-war system, promoting free trade, setting up institutions to support international trade like the World Trade Organization, we've seen an explosion in international trade and investment, and similarly an explosion in the standard of living around the world and in the United States. GDP per capita is 5 times higher today than what it was in 1945. Same number in the United States. The average American is 5 times richer today than in 1945. And then also if we think about human freedom, we often forget that in 1945 there were only about a dozen democracies in the world. Now almost 100 countries are democratic countries. So the world is safer, richer, and freer today than in 1945, and I think it was directly the result of this free world system the United States and Italy created. So I think it's remarkable what we've accomplished. The system is coming under new challenges, threats from these revisionist autocracies, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Also threats from within our own societies, questioning whether this approach still makes sense. But I do think that we've accomplished so much together over the past 70 years, and I think there are good reasons for that cooperation. We face shared challenges. I think we do see eye to eye on the Russia threat, the China threat, the threat from terrorism and on NATO's southern flank. And I think we see shared opportunities as well, increased opportunities for trade between the United States and Italy that could make both of our societies wealthier. So I think for all of these reasons, the fundamentals are strong. The reason for us to continue to cooperate remain strong. And yes, there will be a U.S. election in November. I'm sure there'll be other surprises between now and then. I hope not another assassination attempt. I hope not another major candidate dropping out, but there will probably be surprises. But I think regardless of those surprises, the fundamentals are strong and the transatlantic relationship will remain strong. So.
Noi lo speriamo, ce lo auguriamo. Grazie davvero, grazie Matteo Kroenig, grazie a tutti voi per essere stati qui, grazie a chi ci ha seguito da remoto, grazie per questo davvero punto di vista privilegiato che hai voluto offrire qui questa sera. E in bocca al lupo a tutti noi, in bocca al lupo per le elezioni americane, grazie a tutti, buonasera. Sei proprio bravo, sei molto